Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Hello? Hey guys. Okay. So, a little bit of a change of scenery today, but that's all right. Let's just do a little general history right here from Useful Charts. My name is Connor. Hello, if you are new. I like to watch things and learn stuff. If you are not ready to learn, the door's over there this time. Let's go.
Today, I'm going to give you
Preemptively.
a very broad overview of human history. I'll be using the latest version of my timeline of world history chart, which is available as a poster from my website, usefulcharts.com. In particular, I'm going to be showing you how history can be divided into various time periods or ages, and I'll be explaining how these divisions end up highlighting some of the most important turning points in world history.
Haven't made a video in the past 2 days. I'm back.
Let me start by explaining the basics of how this chart works. The vertical scale represents the flow of time, with time moving forward as you move down the page.
Okay.
Every white line represents 100 years, and the scale is equidistant, which means that the distance between two lines near the top of the chart is exactly the same as it is near the bottom.
Okay.
This is important because it allows for accurate comparisons to be made, and thus gives the viewer a proper perspective on time. Horizontally, the various sections of the chart...
Yeah, I really don't like linear, equidistant, because there's so much less recorded history when you go way further back, and so it's I like it
represent different parts of the world.
I gotta shut up.
Horizontally, the various sections of the chart represent different parts of the world. So on the far left, we have the Americas, followed by Africa, Europe, Asia, and finally the Pacific Islands. Every line on the chart represents a specific culture, civilization, or empire, and the width of the line represents the relative importance of that culture when compared to other cultures from the same time period or region. The next thing we need to talk about are the terms AD and BC, and their equivalents CE and BCE. AD means Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of the Lord. Basically, it's meant to measure the years from the birth of Jesus. Anything before that point is called BC, which stands for before Christ. Now, most scholars today have actually concluded that Jesus was probably born in 4 BC, so keep in mind that the scale is a bit off. So as we move backwards through time, the AD dates go down, but then once we get to BC, the dates start going back up. And I should point out that there is...
So, like, the 17th century AD is the 1600s. So that means the first century BC would be 1 BC would be 99 BC to 1 BC. And then the second century BC would be 100 BC to 199 BC, right?
There is no C, the dates start going back up. And I should point out that there is no year 0. So basically the year 1 BC was followed immediately by the year 1 AD. Nowadays, it's becoming more and more standard for historians to use the terms CE and BCE instead. CE stands for Common Era, and BCE stands for Before the Common Era. The reason for the change is simply an attempt to use a more neutral term, which makes sense considering that 75% of the world is not Christian. Okay, now
right. The reason I sort of like squinted first, I knew what the reasoning, but like you're still using the start to.
We've got that under our belt. The next question we need to address is, what is the starting point for history? In other words, where do we draw the line between history and prehistory? Well, on this chart, I used the year 3300 BCE as my starting point. The reason for this is that this is approximately when writing first appeared. The
Okay.
basic idea is that without written records, we can't have history. Therefore, everything before the emergence of the first writing systems is best categorized as prehistory.
Fair enough.
And history. And of course, prehistory goes back much farther than 5,300 years. If we're talking about the prehistory of our species, Homo sapiens, it goes back about another 200,000 years, a time period also known as the Stone Age.
I thought it was
and
3
if
million.
we're talking about the prehistory of the planet Earth, well, that goes back about 4.5 billion years. But this chart doesn't cover prehistory. Instead, it starts with the emergence of written records and goes from there. So on this chart, history is divided into 6 main time periods: the Early Bronze Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, Classical Antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Modern Period. Let's now take a look at each, one by one. The Bronze Age gets its name based on the fact that humans first started to make things out of bronze around the same time that they first developed writing. This occurred in 3 main areas: Egypt, Sumer, which is modern-day Iraq, and the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan. Unfortunately, the writing system used in the Indus Valley is yet to be deciphered, so we can only read the records from Egypt and Sumer. But we do know that these 3 civilizations did trade with one another, and that throughout the early Bronze Age, each grew in terms of both size and technology. At the start of this period, the Sumerians had already invented the wheel, the plow, and the sail. But during the early Bronze Age, they also went on to develop astronomy and mathematics. Over in Egypt, it was during the early Bronze Age that the great
How do you discover mathematics?
and mathematics. During the early Bronze Age, they also went on to develop astronomy and mathematics.
Because there's mathematics. Okay. So written mathematics.
Over in Egypt, it was during the early Bronze Age that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built. Besides these 3 civilizations, the only other place in the world to have large cities was over in what is today Peru. There, a culture known as the Norte Chico civilization was thriving. But strangely, although they built large stone structures, they appear to have had no writing system and no pottery. Stone structures dating from the early Bronze Age can also be found at Stonehenge in England and on the island of Malta, but neither of these places had large populations. Okay, so that was the early Bronze Age. Now let's look at the Bronze Age proper. Dividing these 2 time periods is a very important event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, named because it occurred approximately 4.2 thousand years ago. The exact cause of the event is still debated, but what we do know
Is this sea people?
is that it resulted in approximately 100 years of extremely dry conditions
that's
worldwide.
end of Bronze
Because of this, the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Akkadian Empire, which had conquered Sumer, and the Indus Valley civilization all declined rapidly. And in the time period that followed, we get a new set of cultures. Egypt was revived as the Middle and New Kingdoms, and the Sumerian civilization eventually evolved into the Babylonian civilization. But in South Asia, we get a more dramatic change. The Indus Valley cities disappear altogether, and we get a new set of people arriving, the Indo-Aryans, who were part of the larger Indo-European group. During the Bronze Age proper, we also get civilizations arising in other parts of the world for the first time, including in China, Sub-Saharan Africa, and unbeknownst to many people, North America. There we get the Poverty Point culture, where large mounds and complex settlements were built. Finally, we also get the first civilization in Europe, the Minoans on the island of Crete. Midway through the period, though, there was a volcanic eruption nearby, which led to the downfall of the Minoans and the rise of the Mycenaean Greeks instead. This catastrophe could very well have been the event that birthed the Atlantis myth. The next big turning point in history occurred around 1200 BCE, and it is known as the Bronze Age collapse. For reasons that are still somewhat unclear,
people.
the major civilizations in Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt all disappeared almost instantaneously. What followed is often called the Greek Dark Ages, a period in which the historical record for the region goes somewhat silent. Interestingly, it is during this silent period
I find it so cool, not cool, just interesting, how there are periods in history where the people who lived before you actually lived a more sophisticated and advanced technological lifestyle than you are. That's sort of depressing and yet makes sense.
that many of the world's most famous legendary tales supposedly took place, such as those found in the Jewish Torah, the Greek Iliad, and the Hindu Mahabharata. The Bronze Age collapse also coincided with the first use of iron in the Middle East. Therefore, the period in which the Greek Dark Ages took place is also aptly called the Iron Age. This is the third and final period in what is known as the Three Age system, consisting of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. The next period is not actually part of the Three Age system. This is because after approximately 600 BCE, we no longer have to rely entirely on archaeology to get information. As I mentioned earlier, humans have been writing since 3300 BCE. But there is nothing surviving from the Bronze Age or Iron Age that could really be considered a history book. Sure, we have the names of kings, lists of battles, and other details carved into rock and metal, but we don't have anything that starts with, "In this treatise, I am going to record the complete history of X." But around this time, we do start to get such writings. For example, from a Greek guy named Herodotus, who is often called the father of history. So in other words, we know a heck of a lot more information about this next period, called classical antiquity, than we know about the previous periods. Classical antiquity is when the Greeks and the Romans laid the foundations for what would become known as Western civilization, mostly by borrowing and building upon information gained from the earlier Bronze Age civilizations. But there was a lot going on in other parts of the world as well. For example, in Mesoamerica, Olmec culture would go on to influence classical Mayan culture with its intricate calendar and writing system. And in North America, there was an extensive trade network where lots of different types of art was being exchanged. In Africa, the long-standing kingdom of Kush eventually gave way to the kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. There was also the three mighty Persian empires, the Maurya and Gupta empires in India, and the first imperial dynasty in China. Eventually, a trade route between all these areas opened up, known as the Silk Road, and thus the western parts of Eurasia and the eastern parts of Eurasia were connected for the first time. But perhaps even more importantly, it was during classical antiquity that humanity's current moral and philosophical foundations were laid. Simultaneously, yet independently, we got Greek philosophy, the Bible,
Confucius?
the Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, and the writings of Confucius. We also saw the first experiments with democracy and the first evidence of truly scientific thinking. But this golden age of human development did not last.
These terms, scientific thinking and math, I think I know what he means by them, but these are two terms that I think even some animals use. Maybe don't go that far, but you and I used before we could really even talk, I would think. And so these terms, science, scientific research, and math, I think are. Do you know what am I going down a rabbit hole here? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like I think they are more institutional things than maybe. Never mind.
Last forever. It came to an end around the year 500 CE.
I just mean like math and scientific thinking is just stuff that we do. And so I think what he means, I think I'm overanalyzing. I think what he means is just like written, clear, evidence-based thinking.
With the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In other areas, the classical period ended a little earlier, such as in China, or a little later, like in Mesoamerica. But basically,
I missed like 20 seconds.
This golden age of human development did not last forever. It came to an end around the year 500 CE with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In other areas, the classical period ended a little earlier, such as in China, or a little later, like in Mesoamerica. But basically, all over the world, most of the major classical civilizations eventually crumbled. We then get what's called the Middle Ages. The word middle is used for this period because it is located in the middle between ancient history, which consists of everything we've covered so far, and modern history, which we'll be getting to next. It's also called the medieval period, medieval simply meaning Middle Age. But one term that really shouldn't be used for the medieval period, but often is the Dark Ages. The reason for this is that the so-called Dark Ages were really just limited to Western Europe. Other areas during this time, such as the Middle East and China, were actually experiencing new golden ages.
This chart is fantastic. This channel is fantastic.
So what made things in Western Europe change so drastically? Well, numerous theories have been put forward, but one thing we know for certain is that it involved large-scale migrations in several parts of the world. Whether or not these migrations were sparked by climate change or some other natural phenomena, we can't be sure. But it ended up creating kind of a domino effect. For example, the Huns moved into Europe from the east, and this pushed several Germanic tribes south, bringing them into conflict with Rome. Eventually, it was these Germanic tribes, known to the Romans as barbarians, who caused the fall of the Western Empire and plunged Europe into the so-called Dark Ages.
But I always get the Huns, or I'm less so. So the Turks, the Huns, and then the Khan, Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun, I feel like are almost like interchangeable names to people who don't really know history much. I might just be projecting. But when you're just learning about history, that I feel like the Huns and Genghis Khan are a bit confusing, but they're very different.
But it wasn't just barbarians that caused trouble. In the years 535 and 536, there were several extreme weather events, perhaps started by a large volcanic eruption, that led to famines and cool, dry weather all over the world. There was also the first bubonic plague, also known as the Plague of Justinian, that killed 50% of the population in some cities. In the East, these events did not lead to the eastern half of the empire falling, but they did set the stage for the rise of a new civilization nearby, Islam. But while Islam was expanding in the Middle East, Christianity was expanding in Europe. Eventually, areas that started out as barbarian kingdoms evolved into major powers, such as England.
One thing about Islam is that it seemed to really, like, Judaism is something that goes back really long time, and so it's a bit more difficult to kind of, for me, maybe I have to look into it more to see how it kind of rose up. But Christianity really seems like it just kind of got up a bit and clinged on and were persecuted and finally spread and was a thing. Whereas Islam is just like, boom, got armies together, the original guy dies, they keep moving on and conquering, and then it's just a thing. And it seems like it's like a blink of an eye compared to the Christianity spread.
France and the Holy Roman Empire. But there were lots of other powers, such as England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. But there were lots of other things happening in the world during the Middle Ages as well. For example, in West Africa, we get several major empires for the first time, including the Mali Empire, with its ruler Mansa Musa, who was the richest person ever in all of world history. And
do
in
we know
southern
that?
Africa, there was the city of
That seems to be just like a fact that we just like, yeah, you know, it's like he was the richest man in history. How do we know that? Like, Mansa Musa. So I'm not saying that it's wrong. I don't know. I'm just saying it's like, and then Mali Empire, and then Mansa Musa, who is the richest man in history, and then it continues. And I'm like, well, how do we know that?
Great Zimbabwe, which included the first large structures ever in that part of the world. A lot was happening in the Americas as well. We don't tend to think of cities existing in pre-Columbian North America, but they
Sorry, guys. I'm gonna look up Mansa Musa after this.
did. There was in pre-Columbian North America, but they did. There was Cahokia in what is now Illinois, as well as the Puebloan cities in New Mexico. In Mesoamerica,
New England?
the Aztecs were dominating. And in South America, there were the Incas. Finally, it was during the Middle Ages that we get the largest land empire of all time, the Mongol Empire, started by Genghis Khan. Okay, we now come to the sixth and final time period, the Modern Age, which is the period in which we live today. One could argue that the transition started with the most deadly pandemic of all time, the Black Death, also known as the Second Bubonic Plague. Once again, up to 50% of the population in many cities passed away, and this perhaps helped spark the Renaissance. The Eastern Roman Empire finally...
Call me boring or whatever, but I think the modern period is the most fascinating. I love ancient history. Maybe... never mind.
Fell
I take that
to
back.
the Ottoman Turks, and in Italy there was a renewed interest in studying the art and philosophy of the classical period. Around the same time, Europeans started colonizing the Americas, and major advances were made in science. This in turn led to the Industrial Revolution, which then gave way to the Technological Revolution, which we are still experiencing today. Okay, so that was obviously a very broad overview. But what I think...
Hey, the U.S., I think, is a bit thicker than the British Empire, guys. I want to point that out.
Perhaps most interesting and most important are the similarities that can be seen in the transitions between each time period.
Wow, so the thick boys. The thick boys are... Okay, wow, China's got a few thick boys. Rome is the thick boy. And the U.S. is pretty thick. And then look at Europe as like a lot of medium thickness. And you got the British Empire. France, pretty big, 1800s. But you can tell Rome seems to be the king in history. It seems like the Roman Empire is the pinnacle of power in terms of proportionality of when they lived. It seems like no one has been as influential or unmatched in the world since the peak of the Roman Empire. And the Han Dynasty is clearly a big deal. Same with the Tang Dynasty and a lot of other dynasties down here. Ottoman Empire, pretty thick. Very nice.
Often they involved a combination of climate events, mass migrations, and pandemics. Three things that we are currently dealing with in the year 2020. Does this mean that we are on the verge of entering a new period in human history? I guess only time will tell. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for making. What an amazing video. What do I think? I think that there is never a time where stuff isn't happening. And so to think that you're in a special place in history because X, Y, and Z are happening, maybe you're right, but show me a place in history where that's not really happening, or at least that we know it's not happening. You know, back here, it's hard to tell, and there wasn't exactly a lot of, you know, powers nations, powers, civilizations that we knew of. But I like to think that it's very unlikely that you are living in a time that is abnormal. very unlikely. Like, you could argue that living during the 1860s or something like that, 1870s in Great Britain or the US could have been more amazing than living now. Even though now is pretty darn cool, I gotta admit. I'm trying to, like, put it down a bit because, of course, where you live, you're gonna imagine... Awesome video, guys. Awesome video. Yeah, I don't think the time we live in is exactly special. I think, unless you want to call everything special, but then nothing is. Anyways, awesome. Gonna get back up and in my room, get back into the swing of things. Hope you guys are doing well. See you next time.